Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, October 17th, 2021, and today I'm going to be talking about President Donald Trump saying that if Republicans do not decertify the 2020 election results, that elections will not go well for the GOP for the next 4 years, pretty much saying that Republicans will not be enthusiastic at all to vote in the upcoming midterms or presidential election out of the fear that their votes will not be counted in a fair manner. Now, while President Trump's claims are partially founded on the idea that Republicans are only enticed to vote to counteract what they view as some type of election fraudulent system built within the Democratic Party across the nation, it really doesn't make sense to keep rehashing the 2020 election, or I guess just relitigating an election that occurred nearly a year ago. This makes no sense for the GOP to continue down this very dark pathway of continuing the election lies because they are not popular amongst the majority of the nation. In fact, over 60% of this country says that the election was free and fair and that Joe Biden legitimately won the election. Meaning that if the Republican Party, as Donald Trump is now describing or sort of recommending them to do so, takes such a position in terms of the election fraud, you've already seen top Republicans such as Mitch McConnell and Paul Ryan and a number of those in and outside of Congress say that the election was legitimate, that the election was not rigged. It even goes so far as you have top Republicans that were close to Donald Trump, Nikki Haley, Mike Pence, that refused to say that the election was entirely rigged. They did leave it open to a realm of possibility, but never did come out on the complete offense, the same way at least that Donald Trump did. But as Donald Trump remains the most popular figure within the Republican Party today and a frontrunner for the 2024 race, he is looking ahead to what might happen if the GOP does not continue repeating his rhetoric. And whether or not he views this as a legitimate reason or a legitimate concern for the 2024 election, I think a lot of this is just him trying to ensure control and maintain that control within the Republican Party, because it does seem at this point in time that his name is beginning to slip out of the minds of many Republican voters and onto newer Republicans like Ron DeSantis, like Nikki Haley, and others. And to sort of put back this idea of the election being rigged back onto the Republican Party, this all circulates around one person. The more that the Republican Party refers to Donald Trump as the legitimate president of the United States, as someone who fairly won the 2020 election that was quote-unquote stolen by Joe Biden, the more and more that you hear about that, the more that Donald Trump's name will be recognized and utilized, and it will just be a good bump for him for the 2024 elections. But I think that this point that Donald Trump is making doesn't really make sense to me. When you take a look at the numbers in terms of those who believe that American democracy is fraudulent, the system is rigged, you only get about 36% of Americans that say that Joe Biden did not legitimately win enough votes to win the presidency. That is over 1 in 3 Americans, but it's by no means a very big portion of the country that this is a winnable strategy to move on. Looking at 36%, that is a very small subsection relative to what these numbers should be in order for a major political party to take such a controversial position. Typically speaking, the Republican Party takes positions that might be unpopular across the nation, but can counteract that by taking other positions, such as different positions on the economy that may be more popular amongst the wealthier people in this nation, or may take certain social issues and take them in a more positive manner, such as being on the offense against the defund the police movement, which is not favored by the majority of the nation. But when it comes down to issues such as voter fraud, the Republican Party has always been the party that does have some type of skepticism about the Democratic Party's legitimacy during the election, but never have we seen it in such full force, and never have we seen really the American public go against it in such a high fashion. To have 64% of the nation say that Joe Biden either had enough votes to win the presidency or to have no opinion in the adversary against it is super significant. And President Trump, in a way, is misleading the Republican Party by saying that the GOP won't vote in 2022 if they don't repeat his election lies, sort of saying that Republicans will not be voting if we don't solve the presidential election fraud. But I would simply counteract that by saying that this is not a popular position, and that's really what matters for 2022. Because when I take a look at these Senate elections, I actually think that the election fraud claims have caused much more harm than good when it comes down to the Senate and the House of Representatives. For instance, the state of Georgia went blue on the presidential level in 2020. Donald Trump continuously visited that state even after the runoff elections, but leading up to the very important runoff elections that determined Senate control, and said, Georgia, you have a rigged election. Brad Raffensperger, someone you elected back in 2018 to serve as the Republican Secretary of State, he rigged it alongside Joe Biden. When you have people like Brian Kemp, who was campaigning on behalf of Donald Trump leading up to the election, and Donald Trump came down to visit the state of Georgia on his behalf ahead of 2018. Very similar groups voted for these two candidates. When you have voters saying, they're looking at it and Donald Trump is attacking their top Republicans that were just recently elected, saying somehow they are in cahoots with President Biden, they were working with him to rig the elections, and they refused to overturn the election results. None of that looks popular for someone who just lost the state. You're already in the minority due to the fact that voters had turned against you after voting for you by over 5 points in the 2016 presidential election. In addition, you are going against the top Republicans who are more well-known statewide, and obviously you are going to be well-known as the President of the United States, but these are people that these Republicans trust. These are institutionalized candidates that were served as Secretary of State, served in other statewide positions, that now are all of a sudden the legitimacy of them are being stripped away solely because Donald Trump does not want to admit that he lost the election. And consequently, the Georgia 2 Senate races went to the left. Raphael Warnock won his seat against Kelly Loeffler, and Jon Ossoff defeated David Perdue. Jon Ossoff's race, I think, really stunned the Republican Party the most because he was never favored to win this race. David Perdue actually got less of the vote the second time the vote was counted in terms of percentage and raw vote share. Jon Ossoff went from being in a position where he was just at 48%, and then all of a sudden won 51% of the vote, 50 to 51% of the vote by the time we had reached the finalized point of the election. So when you take a look at what happened in Georgia, I think this is a perfect representation about how these election fraud claims really pushed down the vote and actually shifted some people over towards the towards the left wing. Because when you take a look at the shift from November, every single county, with the exception of a few, shifted towards the left relative to how they voted back in the 2020 presidential election. A very significant portion of them ultimately went more for the Democratic Party than they did in a year in which Joe Biden won, in which the Democratic Party won Georgia for the first time since 1992. And if that isn't testament enough about why this type of rhetoric does not work, I can't understand, what could prove to be in opposition to this, at least to the Republicans that wish to carry on with such a tactic. Because President Trump tried to spin the reality of this situation, saying that it was because David Perdue and Kelly Loeffler did not embrace him enough, did not embrace his election fraud claims enough to win the Senate races. Well, I want him to actually take a look at any of the ads that were ran by Kelly Loeffler during that election cycle. In fact, the main reason why she was able to get a significant portion of that support in the early primary when Doug Collins was a much more well-known name, and why she was able to defeat him, it was because of the fact that she had labeled herself as President Trump's main candidate. That was the thing. When she had come out in her ads and sent out TV ads, she always touted the 100% pro-Trump voting record. Kelly Loeffler was an embodiment of President Trump in the state of Georgia, and it's absolutely false to say that she did not embrace him enough. I would argue that she embraced him too much, and the same thing for David Perdue. And some Republican governors have actually been pushing back on this because they know this is not the right way to go. Like Brian Kemp and Doug Ducey in the state of Arizona, both of them have been called on recently by President Trump to decertify the election results. In September of 2021, and this is nearly a year after the election, we are actually about to hit Election Day of 2021, nearly a year after, Doug Ducey and Brian Kemp are saying no. We will not overturn the election results. And I think that also the way that this election fraud claim has really been detrimental to the GOP in terms of the Senate race isn't just the state of Georgia, but also some of these more individual races. The state of Arizona, I really think, could have been a shoe-in race for Governor Doug Ducey. He has declined to run largely because Donald Trump has pressured him not to. Donald Trump said, even to his closest advisors, this is all speculative, but you really wouldn't put it past him, especially after those claims made towards Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp. But he had made that discussion towards his inner circle about how if Doug Ducey decides to run in Arizona, that Donald Trump would be more inclined to endorse a Democrat than Doug Ducey. In fact, going so far to say that he would even consider campaigning on behalf of a Democrat. Now, in terms of the reality of that, I don't think that is necessarily true, but the fact is Donald Trump will not give Doug Ducey his support in the state of Arizona. But before the election actually occurred, had Donald Trump won the state of Arizona, this circumstance would not even arisen because Donald Trump and Doug Ducey campaigned together. Donald Trump campaigned for Doug Ducey, endorsed him, and vice versa. And leading up to the election, they were on the best of terms. And Doug Ducey was a shoo-in for this race. His popularity beforehand, even during the pandemic, remained in the plus double digits. In 2018, when Democrats won control of the House in the state of Arizona in terms of the amount of House of Representative seats in Washington, D.C., and the Senate race there, when that Senate race went blue, when the more seats that were sent to the House were more Democratic than they were Republican, I mean, that state was definitely taking a shift, but yet somehow Doug Ducey won by 14 points statewide. That wasn't just some type of random chance. That's because he was popular and could have easily won this Senate race, even against the likes of Mark Kelly. But because President Trump has attacked him, this took what would have been an easy opportunity to be a pickup for the GOP away from them, and actually now is favored to go to the Democratic Party, even with so much happening against them nationwide. And I think that alone is enough to be a testament that, again, these election fraud claims have caused more harm than good. And while Donald Trump might be trying to make an argument that the GOP won't be enthusiastic to vote, many other people will be much less to be enthusiastic to vote for the GOP if they continue these claims. You don't need to worry about the amount of Republicans that will vote for you. If Donald Trump can get them out there, he will get them out there regardless if they quote-unquote solve the issue of election fraud. But when you have independents, when you have conservative-leaning members that don't identify with a political party, or libertarians, people that might be inclined to vote for the GOP but are apprehensive because of President Trump, if the Republican Party truly adopts this election lie rhetoric on a nationwide level, and not to say that they haven't, but there definitely has been some pushback and some issues here and differences within the GOP, if they decide to adopt it for 2022, it just simply isn't going to help them. There is no reason to keep continuing down this pathway of the election fraud claims, of the 2020 election being decertified, because this is clearly not a popular position. After the Arizona audit actually found that Joe Biden gained more votes, Republicans called on the audit to be audited. People couldn't comprehend that Joe Biden fairly won the state of Arizona. And as unfortunate as that is, the people who couldn't comprehend it are not in the majority. In fact, there are polls in the state of Arizona that showed that the majority of voters there do not support the audit because it's funded by taxpayers and will find absolutely nothing. And it found absolutely nothing. While there may be some portions of the country that support an audit, support a complete recount, the majority of the nation is telling Donald Trump and telling the Republican Party, do not use this as your campaign plan. You cannot win the 2022 House elections with just 36% of the vote. You cannot win the Senate elections with just 36% of the vote. And obviously, they will get more than 36%. I expect them to get a pretty high amount, but that is contingent on them playing their cards correctly. They need to ensure that the Senate races and House elections move smoothly and move beyond the 2020 election. All of this would be really necessary in order to counteract the Joe Biden presidency for the GOP in terms of a checks and balances system. And if they're making the argument that Joe Biden didn't fairly win the election in the first place, if Republicans have some type of idea that Donald Trump will be reinstated or will be able to decertify, then recertify the election results in his favor, whatever it might be, obviously this is going down that conspiracy theory rabbit hole. But if there is that type of discussion, there isn't that question of checks and balances on the Democratic Party or on Joe Biden in not a number of these races. I mean, when you're taking a look at the Senate, when you're taking a look at the House, they could have easily positioned the Georgia Senate races as the first opportunity for the Democratic Party to be pushed against by the Republican Party. They had won in Georgia before. They won John Ossoff's race previously back in 2014 by 7 points. They won Warnock's race by 13 points in 2016. So these races were absolutely winnable, yet the messaging just wasn't on track. You know, if Donald Trump was out there saying that I fairly won the election, I should be president of the United States at this point, there isn't that discussion about whether or not people should be pushing against the incumbent president. And I think that is a very big part of messaging when it comes down to midterms, having that checks and balances on the president. There's just so many things wrong with this type of strategy, so many things that the Democratic Party can and will exploit, as they did in January of 2021. I mean, I cannot even tell you how baffling it is to think about this. If we were before the election back in November and we thought, you know, Democrats won control of the House, Joe Biden won the presidency, if two races were at stake in an already seemingly red state, you would never think the Democrats could expand on their margin, but they did because of these claims. And they haven't worked, and they aren't going to work for 2022, and I think it's something that the Republican Party needs to recognize now before it's too late. I understand that President Trump is that overarching figure, and a lot of what he says goes, but in terms of this case, it simply cannot. This is not a winning strategy. 2022 will not go their way if they nationalize this and take this up as a mainstream position, because it already cut them out of a Georgia Senate race that is going to be up in 2026, and it is likely cutting them out currently out of the upcoming Arizona Senate race and might screw them over in a number of other races in more competitive states. When you have GOP frontrunners in North Carolina, in Pennsylvania, in Ohio, and Georgia that are all big proponents of the big lie, people are going to turn against them. If it's unpopular on the nationwide level, on states that slightly lean a little bit more to the right, it may be slightly more popular to take such a position. But for instance, if it's unpopular, meaning only 36% of the nation actually views this as a good position for the Republican Party, I can only imagine in states such as Pennsylvania, which is just a few points more to the right relative to the rest of the nation, that number is only 41%. This will never be a winning strategy outside of solid red states, and it's time for the Republican Party to accept that. This argument that Donald Trump's making is not true at all, and I think that at this point in time, someone high up within the GOP needs to push back, at least if they want to do well in 2022. They are repeating the same mistakes they made through the runoffs and through many of these special elections, and they simply cannot move forward with this. The first true test will be the 2021 governor elections in New Jersey and Virginia. I am super excited to see what is happening across those races because it will be something that is super important to understand and give us more of an understanding about how 2022 will go. And I think that as we move forward beyond that point, it will sort of just confirm my already suspicions about how this type of rhetoric and this type of messaging will be detrimental to the GOP on the nationwide and localized level everywhere across the country. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2022 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.